So I'm so happy everyone's here. For those joining us, we have David Edwards and Edward Hoffman. My name is Jessica Fox. I am the Screen and Broadcast Sector Specialist for XpoNorth. Absolutely love my job because I get to do things like this. David is the founder of ArtScience Labs and founder of Sensory Cloud, and also a professor at Harvard, teaches at Harvard. And we have Edward Hoffman here, who I think, Edward, you win for the coolest title for a job out of this conference, but you're former Chief Knowledge Officer for NASA and also now CEO of Knowledge Strategies, LLC. So again, this is the future of work is stories. It's an expert on expert session, which means we're just going to dive into who you are, what you do, and explore this topic, which I'm so excited for. Can you tell us a little bit, Edward, we'll start with you, a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, it's always good to talk with you, Jessica, and look forward to chatting with David and where we go from here. Really, I've spent my life, if you're talking about one word, around learning, and how do you get organizations, teams, and really smart, talented people to work effectively together, whether it's on a mission to the moon or if it's on developing a new drug or putting together a movie. The key issue is that people are smart, they're capable, they know how to work. And I would always say at NASA to the project folks, you're going to decide if you want to be successful by the way you work with each other and share together and respect, or if you decide not to work effectively together, it'll have an impact. So really, in terms of my life, it's all been about learning, development, and working with smart people and teams.
That's brilliant. And thank you. And just for total honesty and transparency's sake, I was lucky enough to work with Ed, and that's all true when he says it's wonderful. David, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, I have taught at Harvard for the last 20 years. Before I came to Harvard, I was an applied mathematician, and my first invention related to inhaled insulin. And since then, I've been really, really interested in improving human health and well-being through every breath we take. And that has led me from healthcare, drugs, and vaccines, both for-profit and not for-profit work in Africa, to moving out of regulated aerosol delivery to consumer behavior, really interested in how can we make every breath we take, whether it's regulated or not, improve human health. And that's led me to work with artists and designers and try and create spaces where creators can really co-create with the public, and made me rethink culture. And so I've spent a lot of time in Paris, and ArtScience Labs is really a framing of a number of environments that explores that. Anyway, all of this led to work that I'm doing right now, and a product called Fend, which is a new airway hygiene for cleansing the lungs, and also for ultimately bringing sensory signals into our upper airways that help us eat right and sleep right. So I'm really also, like Edward, interested in learning. I mean, I think it's hard to adapt as the workforce needs to adapt today without learning every day. And to learn, we need to be mindful. And so it's a really fascinating conversation. So thank you for having me here.
I'm so excited for you both to be here. There's a lot to dive into. And before we do, I just remind our attendees that there's a Q&A box in the bottom, so I don't have to be the only one asking questions, because I know a lot of things will get brought up that you might have questions about. So please use that Q&A box, and about 15 minutes before the end, depending on how many questions we've accumulated, we will get to them and we will go through them. First things first, you two are pretty extraordinary. David, you are an inventor and a polymath. You are able to seamlessly move through the world of arts and innovation and science as if it were completely natural and that there weren't these barriers built up. It's extraordinary. And Ed, you come from a psychology background and you enter the world of NASA, where again, you bring this liberal arts understanding to teamwork and science and projects. So I want to ask you both, I think where you meet is why stories? Why are stories so important to you and interesting? And why, after all the work you've done in all these different fields, why does it come down to story?
Who starts? What a great
question first.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
I'm happy to take a shot at that. Well, I think for sure that's what brings us together. I want to also point out that there's something very childlike about the moving from artistic thinking to scientific thinking and learning at just a massive rate. And so I think I'd like to believe that Edward and I share a kind of childlike approach to life and to work. For children and for all of us who are discovering, the future is all stories, right? And so you kind of exploring different futures through narratives that are moving to you and that make you wake up in the morning and just feel super excited for the day, and you discover, right? And you're all the more interested to learn because you've sort of made a bet, right? It's kind of a bet on a certain narrative. So knowing how to tell narratives and ultimately believe in narratives and finding people who can share them, that's really what Making Tomorrow is all about, I think.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I think Samuel L. Johnson says curiosity in great and generous minds is the first passion and the last. So that sense of openness and wonder and having a hypothesis about the way you think the world works and being delighted when you're proven wrong. I think you're quite right. That sense of openness is huge. Ed, how about you? Why story?
Yeah, well, I've always loved stories. You know, I love movies and books. So I always look for ways to bring in things I like, right, to the work I do. But I had a practical reason for reasons that I still find hard to believe. A number of years after the Challenger disaster, I was working at Goddard in a field center, and I was called by Washington saying they wanted me to establish a learning academy for NASA around projects in engineering. And my initial reaction is, you folks are crazy. Typical Washington, coming up with the wrong. What would a psychologist know about learning and development for engineers and project people? And basically, I ended up accepting that. And for the first number of months, I was petrified. I was having tremendous anxiety. Because how do I even know about this field? How do you teach others? I have all these books that I'm trying to figure out the answers, which didn't have it at the time. And we started having sessions, training sessions, forums. And we would get, really smart people who would get up there and show slides and explain things. And I had one guy, his name was Jerry Madden, and he was considered one of the best project managers NASA ever had. And I called him, I said, please, would you come and talk at my course? And he said, I'll talk as long as no jacket, no tie, and no slides. And I never had anybody give me, but I said, yeah. And he got on the stage and he mesmerized people. He only told stories. He told stories about problems with Congress. He told stories about running a big program versus a small one. And I looked at the audience and we were all enthralled. And then I started tracking this, and I found that the best leaders, they would come and they didn't really use slides. They didn't tell formulas. They would tell stories. They would lay out the problem and how they cumulatively, collectively solved it. And people were enthralled. Then they have questions, and then they got into a discussion. And I said, this is it. And I remember it locking in. One of the people who was great at that at the end of his session, but before he was starting his next one, said, I've improved that. I said, what did you do? He said, I've taken out all the stories. I realized I was telling a lot of stories. I said, no, that was the best part. And that's when it hit, the power of stories for getting people to have a common understanding and a desire to talk together, and the fact that it's fun. And that's really the way people can learn. After doing, I think probably the best way to learn is by sharing stories with each other.
Now, I can imagine in this world of kind of fake news and propaganda, maybe the word stories might be triggering for some people in the audience, in the sense of, are stories true? When you're talking about it's valuable to tell stories, so they have to be true. For you, where are the boundaries of story, and how are they a tool for what you're doing?
I mean, for me, you always would get into the question of, does it have to be, NASA's an engineering science, somewhat linear type place. And so I get that question of, does it have to be totally accurate? Well, we don't remember. we have our memories of what we're doing right now. And so I think story allows you to kind of talk to the common, what your reflections are, what your experience is. And then you trust the other people you're talking to take you to closer to right. So I don't think a story is, it's not a formula. It's an engagement. And so that's how I see it. But of course, there are people who use stories to manipulate, and that's hard to deal with. But it's an invitation for perceptions, conversations, and different views.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Ed, you frame your storytelling in the context of NASA's mission. I think that storytelling and the rules of storytelling and belief in storytelling and kind of breaking the rules, all of that has a lot to do with what is the framework within the story, within which the story is being told. And I think of that as a cultural environment, an environment where we sort of share values. We kind of understand what our stories are about in a certain way. And, lots of things to be said about that, and fake news and so forth. But in my work, I and my collaborators, and I think pioneers in general, again, astronauts would be a great example, just sort of literal example of this, but pioneers in general quickly figure out whether their mission is aligned, right? Because there's kind of their survival is on the line, and so there's this issue: what are we about really? And stories that are taking us away from that mission are immediately understood to be false, and they just don't even crop up. You kind of know how to curate your buddies, so to speak. But anyway, in my environment, I'm really interested in ideas that have the potential to sustain the human condition. And now that's really broad, and it could be something as, seemingly trite as a brownie that has never been tried before, and that we're not even sure, we can't frame it as, oh, it's going to sustain the human condition, but it's sort of understood to be a kind of relevant to the conversation. And so I think that the stronger the cultural environment, the more permission there is for a digression and error. And I think that we can't be with every story kind of saying, well, is that true or is it not? It's going to be helpful. Is it at least actually, I for many years ran a cultural center in Paris called the Laboratoire. And I found it so interesting to be in the center of Paris and working with artists and designers and the public, which is a very different public than in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I also have spent a lot of my creative life. Much more, if I could sort of simplify, much more idea-centric and less interested in the practical value of that idea. And even, at least my experience was that the more practical it became, the more dangerous became the conversation. Whereas in Cambridge, it tends to be much more about, well, so what does that do for us? And so that also is a part of the cultural environment. So I think this issue of fake news is contextual and super dangerous, right, for all of us storytellers, right? The minute we lose trust in the meaning of stories or the reality of stories, we're really lost.
Yeah, I agree. So to ground this for folks who may not be as familiar with what you're doing currently as I am, can you talk a little bit about your current work and maybe how stories are a part of it?
Interesting. So I mentioned inhaled insulin, and that was a big thing back in the late 90s. And so when I began to teach at Harvard, the anthrax scare happened here in the United States 20 years ago. And I was brought to Washington because I had, in a way, weaponized insulin. And so the question is, well, how do we prevent people from weaponizing pathogens? And so it led me to see that it's possible to put salts in the upper airways and prevent the creation of little droplets that carry disease between us and into us. And so maybe that was a way to sort of protect people generally. And at the time, respiratory droplets today, because of the pandemic, everybody's talking about them. Back then, people really didn't understand them. And so there was a lot of storytelling for sure. And frankly, for 15 years, I've been working on inhaled chocolate and inhaled, many things, actually, food and drinks and sensory signals that tell stories, and just exploring with consumers. In each one of those projects in Paris and here, some of which took place in cultural exhibition context, were stories that framed why would I want to breathe chocolate into my mouth. And it sort of, we told stories to help us all learn what this might mean. And kind of miraculously, when the pandemic began and we had done all this work and learned a lot, we went to the FDA and shared a lot of the data we had. And it led us to get into the human studies last summer. And we have, between then and now, done 8 human studies, and we're now very active in India, and given the crisis there, and really discovered with lots of people a new way of cleaning the lungs, kind of like soap for the lungs, if you will, which is a salt solution that you breathe through your nose and it lands in your very upper airways. And so where we are at right now, this is both a company and a not-for-profit. The not-for-profit's called Next Breath, and developing this airway hygiene for kids around the world. There's about 1 billion kids right now who are in multidimensional poverty because of the pandemic and everything that preceded it. And so we're bringing this out this fall in a both charitable and commercial context in a much more mass market way. And nobody's ever done this before, right? So airway hygiene is new. So helping people do something that they've never done before is totally all about storytelling. So that's what I'm focused on right now.
David, that's amazing, especially in the biotech world. I think storytelling becomes really, really key in getting, we talked about how pioneers need story to convert non-pioneers, and that's huge. Edward, can you talk a little bit about really for you how stories play in what you're doing now?
Yeah, I would say that David, you grabbed me with the notion of breathing in chocolate. And if you ever develop that, I would sign up, whether it's healthy for me or not.
It's coming your way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think there's a integration between art and science, and I've always looked for that because obviously I worked in a scientific place. I had to figure out that angle, and I always looked for ways to bring art, whether it was music or visual, or storytellers like you and Jay, to the place. So you have to justify, how did this come together? And it was clear to me that art and science both try to do the same thing. They try to create meaning or where we're going and where we want to go. And it serves as inspiration, but also as a way to have a platform for honest conversation, right? And so what I do today is I work with a lot of organizations largely in terms of developing capabilities. The biggest concern that organizations have is the totally disruptive world. People have been away from the office for a year. Many people don't want to come back. You have people who've been in a place for many years, they may want to leave. And one example practically of story was I was working with a large, kind of an iconic firm in Europe. And they'd asked me if I could do a session around knowledge and lessons learned. Okay. And of course I had, a few hours or so. And so the first thing that I did was I asked the people, or about 100 practitioners in the room, leaders in the room, and others on video. I said, tell me a story of your proudest moment working here. And share it with a partner, and then share it in small groups, and then let's select a few. And it was a little bit risky because I didn't think they know exactly where I was going with this. But when they started sharing their stories, I started seeing these people who were, in 30, 40 years in this place starting to tear up. And I remember one of the individuals said, I've been here. I've loved this place. It's been my life. It's important to this country and to everything we do. But we've never really spoken about what we're most proud of, the changes we've made. And to me, this is so powerful.
Yeah.
And so that's one example, is that as organizations, we tend to be very efficient. We want formulas, just give us everything you need, fast and quick and cheap. And we don't take time, I think, to recognize the successes. We sometimes avoid the failures, but we also don't, listen to the success stories that David's sharing that triggers interest, but also pride for where we work. Yeah. It's also interesting. I've worked with some pharma firms, and when I walk into their buildings, they usually have pictures on the wall. And they're always the same pictures. They're usually of children, and they're usually of people who've benefited from what's been developed. So that becomes a story. And so I think that's how I use it. I also teach at Columbia. And so with the students, if we're exploring a subject like sustainability, I'll tell them, the word is sustainability. Tell me a story about it. And they'll struggle with it, but usually they'll come up with an issue of how that theme, that word, has impacted them that leads to a large discussion.
Yeah.
So it's a very powerful approach, because I think as humans we're wired for conversation and for stories.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd love to just riff off of that for a second. Your story of the kind of the emotion that stories can surprisingly bring makes me think of a project we did in the around 2008 with the Gates Foundation and James Nachtwey, who's an incredible war photographer, the greatest living war photographer probably, and Jim and a medical scientist at Harvard University did a project around the power of photography in the context of AIDS and TB clinics in Asia. And it led to a really, really powerful exhibition that we ultimately brought to Bangkok for a major Gates Foundation meeting. And I was a Gates Grand Challenge funded scientist. And one of the things that was troubling to me was that when we had our meetings, and everybody was talking about incredibly important work with amazing human impact, but we were all in our scientific modes. And so there was a very big distance between our work and our words and the people who were sort of losing their lives and livelihoods. And so there was this exhibit, which was so overwhelming that people really avoided it, honestly. And so James was invited to give a talk that morning, and he called me the night before, and we had a really interesting conversation. And so he came up to speak, and he was actually very emotional the night before, because he was going to tell stories that he hadn't even thought of telling, actually. And so being in a war-like circumstances, lots of experiences that you don't really feel until you tell them, right? And so he, as a photographer, would tell his stories through photography. And so now he was telling them, and he was really broken up. And so I was worried about what would happen. And so he came up, if anybody knows James Nachtwey, he's a very dignified human being in every level. And so also presents himself very dignified way. He did. He began to tell stories, and everybody began to cry to such a degree that the leading, I'm not going to say who, person at the Gates Foundation actually had to stop the session. It was like there was like 300 people in the room, and it just got, and so, yeah, stories, I think, bring to life, not only the future possibilities, but just what we've lived. And yeah, that's amazing.
They're empathy building, and they move the emotional needle. We can fill our heads with all this information, but you really can't move the emotional needle or our sense of empathy or emotional evolution unless we have story. It communicates so much. That reminds me of what happened when Jay started, XpoNorth was lucky enough to have both Ed and Jay here talking about their NASA story and how people received Jay and his story.
Yeah. No, well, you had introduced me to Jay. It was wonderful to go to Massachusetts to visit with you and Jay and all that. And then we brought him to NASA. Mm-hmm. And he went to every center. And at first, it was one of the few times I was sitting in the front row, I think next to you, and he's up there and he's telling the story in about 45 minutes to all these Jet Propulsion Laboratory, leaders in engineering and science. And
we should
mention saying, what happens if they don't?
Jay is an oral storyteller for people who don't know Jay's work. He tells stories.
And it was, and as a mixture of, reality, but there was fiction in there. He built a relationship of individuals who were going through their career and fell in love at NASA. And it got into very difficult parts of failures, mistakes that we had made in terms of shuttles and loss of life. And I started just sweating, wondering what's going to be the reaction here. And before I even turned around, I could hear people standing, and they were just emotional. And I don't think I've ever told this publicly before, but we had him talking at a major event, and Buzz Aldrin was sitting at the table I was at, and I looked at him, and he started getting emotional. And at the end of it, he said, "This was magnificent." He said, "This guy, he has it. This is what we were all about in terms of the moon mission." So it's it's an example of that, but it has the ability, stories, to be very practical in terms of motivating, in terms of creating a place for dialogue, in terms of, providing a way of learning, but it's also incredibly emotional, which I think taps into humans, because humans have been telling stories for as long as there have been humans, right? That's how we convey with each other. So
it should seem, like a no-brainer that stories are so powerful and important, and it's a self-selecting audience here. So everyone's here because they're interested in story. But in your own work or your own landscape that you work in, have you met a lot of resistance to trying to talk about how important story is, or getting people to?
I myself didn't. Now I'll tell you, and I think you remember this, the first year or two, I told the team not to call it storytelling sessions because I was afraid of the fairy tale Once Upon a Time, and I didn't know how that would react. And I don't know, frankly, if I'd still get my funding for that part of the activity. So we called them Masters with Masters Leadership Forums. And it was funny. The first time we did that, we had these leaders and project leaders and scientists, and they were sharing their stories of complex missions. And they led to this great discussion. At the end of it, I had a few of them come up to me and they said, "I don't know what just happened here. I know it wasn't training, because we don't like training, but this was a place where we can share our experiences, and this was good." And then someone said, "Oh, we just did stories." And I said, just kind of, but I've never seen people truthfully react with a problem to it. But for the first year or so, this goes back over 20 years, I didn't call it that because I was afraid of the potential stigma. But now it's all over in organizations and universities. But I don't think we teach at the early stages the use of story as a communication mechanism. And I think one of the challenges, David, you're telling great stories that makes me interested in terms of the work you're doing, and the salts, the impact on breathing more effectively and sustaining, supporting the human condition. These all go in different directions. But a lot of scientists, a lot of smart people, they don't know how to communicate with an audience that doesn't have that background. And story is the path to do that. I think we need to really teach the use of stories as a communication mechanism in school.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with all that, and really interesting, Ed. I think there's so many things to say about this topic, and just one point to make is I think in the science, academic, engineering environment over the last 10 years, I guess, there's been a clear movement, for reasons I'll talk a little bit more about, from science communication or pitching of ideas, which from business school to writing proposals. That's academia works that way, businesses work that way, and frankly, science museums, just in general, the notion of talking or presenting or convincing has been the mode of advancement of science and engineering, maybe even innovation for a long time. The world is so complicated, it always was, but it's understood to be now so complex that this way of presenting ideas is increasingly unpopular, I would say. And it's ineffective, and it's particularly for those who are approaching an audience that is new to them, or that they can't perfectly understand. Without storytelling, you can't have a conversation. And so I think that this notion of storytelling, I agree with Ed that people are not calling out storytelling well enough to recognize that that's all what we're doing. And that's really how big ideas move forward and how we learn. But people are doing it. And I just want to come back to the science museum context. We've gone from science museums and centers to ways of communicating science and technology that are much more experiential. And frankly, that's happening in the arts also, right? And so the kind of the Louvre sort of approach to art communication and cultural communication is really moving into the past, and we're all coming into this era of storytelling. So it's a good time to be a storyteller, Jessica.
Yeah, I resonate also with what David's saying. I also think, though, it's unfortunate, though, that I think the Louvre, which is one of my favorite, museums. Sometimes it's good to go to a museum and just look at things that aren't interactive, engaging. And I think one of the skills that is good to have is the ability to reflect by yourself. And so I think you need in the learning. And everything we do, all I hear about is active learning. It's got to be active. It's got to be problems. You got to give people things that are stimulating. And yet I think a lot of probably the most brilliant, innovative people, they get a lot of their ideas by their private time, and by the fact that they have a solitary aspect that we don't. But I agree with it. Again, your point is the importance of the engagement, the multimedia, the use of stories that engage is certainly the way things are going.
Yeah.
Just if I could react really quickly to that, yeah, for sure. And I think, yes, that is all needed for sure. And our cultural center was right next to the Louvre, and so we had a lot of interaction with the Louvre. And I think one of the amazing museum, obviously, but the statistics in a museum like that are that by far the majority of people are coming for the first time, and by far the majority of people come to see 3 works of art. And so if you stand in the Louvre and you watch what people are doing, they're really running. They're running to get to something that they're looking for. And so it's hard. It's hard to absorb anyway.
Yeah.
You both teach and work with, I think, younger generations of people who are going out into this brave new, slightly more complex world where storytelling is so important. So do you feel that there are certain stories that are critical right now to be telling?
Yeah, I mean, it's so I teach at Columbia, information knowledge strategy, and I teach future of work. I teach how do you build and bring knowledge to an organization. And so these are all things. What I see is the students that I have, what's very important is story from the standpoint of voice and diverse voices. And they're very aware of if they hear the same story from different people who look the same way, then they'll say, oh, that's great, but where are, diversity of perspectives? And I think they're also very aware of how they find a way to tell their own stories in a way that was different, I'd say from my generation, which was far back. And my generation, you just try to survive school, you try to be respectful, and you try to, graduate, and then you can tell your story. But I think one of the things, and I think it's good, it's an awareness of the students I have that stories are told from, the perspective of who's telling the story. So if all the stories are from men, you're going to get a slight slant. If you bring in women, then you get a different kind of a thing. And then the importance of them having time to figure out their own voice, I think, is very important. So I think there's a lot of an awareness of that, and it gets into issues of diversity and inclusion and belonging and representation.
Yeah, I'm really interested in teaching creative process, and particularly creative process that leads to things that matter to more than just those who are creating, and that also sustain the human condition. And I think that stories about creating are important for students today, in that we are in an era where we're all being asked to create our futures. We're all being asked to create a future that doesn't exist. And so we're all being asked to be creative, whether we're wherever we are in the creative process or the creative team, if you will. And so it's very easy as any of us, but maybe especially young people, to focus on the Tesla or the SpaceX or some outcome that we're aiming for, and some Nobel Prize, if you will. And I think that one thing that stories about creating things that matter share is that the success of creating great things is really anchored in an aesthetic experience that is empowering and mindful, and quite associated with living a good life in a certain way. And even more than it is outcome. And in fact, outcome can be obfuscating, I think, to the final endpoint. So I'm interested in the stories in educational environment that are anchoring students in a very primitive process of survival, really, that they get. And in many ways that the educational system is teaching them away from. And I honestly, I think this issue of learning is, I'm sure Ed, you would probably say the same thing, one that we're all kind of daily struggling with. How do you teach what needs to be learned today well?
Yeah.
And how does that scale? That's just a really big question.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in here because we have some questions coming in and I want to make sure we get to them. We have been talking a lot about oral storytelling. And so I appreciate this question. How is technology going to become more prevalent in storytelling, and do we need it?
I think it's already prevalent. I think it's a good thing. It doesn't matter if we need it. It's going to evolve. Just like we use glasses to see things clearer. We're in a technology here that brings us all together. We're able to connect with people in faster ways. We have to make sure we balance time to come together. I'm a big believer that you need to periodically come together to break bread and to eat for a variety of reasons. But I think technology is it's all different ways that we come together as humans to try to experience each other. Whether it's Clubhouse, a new way of sharing thoughts and ideas, or LinkedIn, or XpoNorth going digital. I think technology, it's a great enhancer. It should be a supplement to the human condition. When it tries to replace the human connection, I think that's a mistake. I see sometimes, I would say, financial types, they sometimes see the savings in dollars. And that's not the way to use technology. It should be a way to enhance how we stay connected and relate with each other and learn from each other.
Great.
I agree with that. I agree with, particularly with how you ended. Well, everything you said, Ed, but I think that just to call it out, we technology has changed how we tell stories. Throughout time, but in an accelerated way, in a really short period of time. And I think it's fair to say that we're in a disequilibrium right now with technology and effective storytelling and knowing how to integrate it well. Clearly, in telling a story, there are many sensorial dimensions to telling that story. And it can be the wind that's blowing across my face and so many things that I can't cognitively identify, honestly. But when I think about that story, or when I'm made to think about that story, 3 years later, it's probably those sensorial dimensions that are really leading me to do that. And I think this gets back to what I said about learning. I think that we're still figuring it out. And so, like Ed said, technology is here to stay, and it generally is an amplifier, but it can be an obfuscator. And I think that the pandemic that we've gone through right now has been, I think, both an accelerator and helpful, but also harmful in many ways to learning and to storytelling. So it's a moving target. We're all learning. We're all learning for sure.
I got to also jump on something I think is important, because you brought it up at the very beginning, David, where I think you said trust is an essential ingredient of a story. And I think that's the important to keep in mind. I've heard leaders, and I know where they're going. It's the wrong direction. We never have to bring people together. You don't have to go to a conference. You don't have to travel to Scotland, because we can save a lot of money, and you can do it through name the tool. And what you lose is that overall the trust of the relationship. Yeah. So I've worked for many years with Jessica. We've eaten together. We've been together. I have trust. I think we have a trust with each other. So if I go into a direction of a story that isn't accurate, we'll discuss it. David and I, we've spoken through this, but it'll be much different, I think, if we get together. And again, we talk and we eat, and then we have a whole audience. I don't even know how many people are watching this, that you can get a conceptual, rational sense of what we're talking about. But I think until you're with people periodically, you can't build the trust to know how you want to approach your science or your art. So I think trust is important, and trust really requires periodically a coming together.
I so agree. So how do we become better storytellers?
Well, I think that being engaged in the adventure of living is the most fundamental, I think, key to telling good stories. I'm sure we all have these stories around us, but I remember I write, and I remember a friend writer who had her first novel have a big success, decided that she was now going to stop working and set up her cabin in the backyard and write for the rest of her life, and she's lost her inspiration. And so that's kind of an obvious thing to say. So I would just call out the importance of firsthand, a surprising experience. And I would also say that from my perspective, the key to that experience is that you be at risk, that you be vulnerable. I think that we're more mindful when we're vulnerable. And that's...
I always, so there's a lot, one of the things I think is good in organizations is to bring in people who teach storytelling, or who should teach it, right? People who have a background who do it. I think you learn, like anything, from getting together with others who have a perspective. But I would offer up two other things. That one is, I tell really students or leaders, what are you interested in? What are you passionate about? I always tell my students, don't tell me something you think I want to hear, because that will bore me. And that's take a position of what's important to you. and tell stories around that. I'm not going to tell stories about accounting. I can't think of anything more boring, but there are people who do accounting who love it. So I think one aspect, and then the other thing I've become much more aware of is, and this goes to, I think, a comment from the anonymous attendee. How do, people are interested in stories, but how do we get our stories told? How do you approach identifying the story? I think it's really important that we create places where all people tell their stories. I was reading a book, I forget now the total title, is Cassandra, maybe Cassandra Telling, but it's basically stories of life and organizations from the perspective of women, and different kinds of realities, and it shifts things. It takes it in a different way. It provokes my thinking, and I think that the lesson there is create space for everyone to tell their story, and don't allow people to say, "Oh, I'm not the expert here. I don't know what David does, so I don't have anything." We have to get comfortable inviting people to tell me a story, and a story can be 3 minutes or it could be 15 minutes, but we need to create room for all of us to share our voice through story.
And I think that's so important. And what both of you said, I just want to highlight because they're key elements to storytelling, I feel, having a space and time and a listener. Sometimes the role of the listener completely goes uncelebrated when we talk about storytelling, but actually having good listeners. And David, what you were saying about that, really diving into the life experience, to being alive as the kind of food, that energy to be able to tell stories. I think I mentioned this before, but Joseph Campbell always says that the prime purpose of stories really is to put us in touch with the experience of being alive.
Yeah,
and
that's wonderful. I
think that's so huge. So, and not to put either of you on the spot, but do you have a favorite story, whether it's a folk tale, a fairy tale, something that's happened to you, something that's been told to you, something that seems to come up again and again for you? That
I can share quickly. I was at this is probably 20 years back. I was at an event in Australia, of all places, and I was invited to attend a Project of the Year type award where they're going to recognize the best project programs and all that kind of stuff. And I was not expected to say anything or to talk. They said you may come up there and shake the hands of people, the NASA guy, and then so I knew I wasn't going to say anything. So I was drinking a lot of good Australian wine, and I was getting a little bit relaxed and happy. And then midway in the talk, someone said, people said they'd love to hear you say a few words. Maybe just a story or something like that. And of course I said yes. And then I think, I'm not really sure exactly what I'm going to say. And I'm a little bit too comfortable, if you know what I'm saying. And so I said, "Oh, just, come up with a story." And I said, "So what's my favorite story that would apply to project people?" And I told the story of the 3 little pigs. And I basically said, I congratulate all you people, because, you have to make decisions about, do you try to do it cheap, like the first pig, just using straw, but then you can get second guessed when it falls apart. If you do it out of brick, which tells the story of everyone loved it, but people may say, "Hey, you spent too much money on that." They don't know that a wolf's coming into town. So I kind of use that as an example of the challenges that people working missions and projects have, the trade-offs, and they loved it, and it flowed naturally. And so I don't know if that's my favorite, but that's probably sorry, because it just came to me, just telling the 3 little pigs, and see how it goes.
I bet people love that.
Yeah. I didn't want to go into some NASA kind of something like that, but it resonated.
It does resonate. David, do you have a favorite story?
Yeah. I'll, briefly, one of my special stories. I was in Paris and was asked to do an interview on NPR, and it was raining, and we had an exhibition going, and I ran across town literally and came into the studio, little booth and glassed-in booth. There's a couple guys who put the headset on and then closed the door, but they could kind of see me. And it was a new program of NPR, and there was the journalist was based in Atlanta, And he said to me immediately, "Hey, would you mind singing?" And I said, "That would be a really bad way to start the interview. Actually, I can't really do this." But you just asked my wife to sing. And what are you talking about? And so it happened that his wife was in my exhibition in Paris, and it was an exhibition. We were asking people to sing, and we were measuring vibrations. And anyway, it was, it really broke the ice. And he said she loved it, and the kid, and all this. And so got to talking, and I was really relaxed, kind of like after a few glasses of wine. And so I just was having fun in my little world. And he at some point said to me, so, midway through this live interview, is there somebody in your life who taught you creativity and to be, one person? And if so, where and who and all of that. And so I'm thinking, and then I said, yeah, it's my dad, actually. And so, my dad is passed at this point, but it was as sons and fathers have issues. So I had this image, and I eventually told this story, but actually I became so emotional that I couldn't speak. And so I'm on live radio, and I was like, for a minute, I couldn't speak, and tears were running right. And I'd be watched by the guys, and it was crazy. But the story was that it occurred to me that my dad, when I was a kid, would get on the basement floor and play with me, and we would create these worlds. And he took me seriously, So
wow. Oh, David, that's so powerful.
Yeah, so
it is. You're demonstrating the real power of that at that moment in that story, and yeah,
it's crazy. I mean, it was a story in me that it was something really basic, but so that's it.
Oh God, David, that's amazing. And I there's another quote that I love, that what we do in life, we do through play. And the fact that, he was able to be on your level and sit on the floor and play with you, and that kind of moment came to you because of that question, is just really amazing. Ed, it does remind me when Jay O'Callahan, that oral storyteller, walked into the kind of cubicle land of NASA, and all these guys in suits were scratching their head being like, "Ed, what are you doing bringing this dude in? What's the deliverable?" And he's like, "A story." And they're like, "What is he talking about?" Jay got them talking about personal stories. Yeah. And a lot of fathers were brought up then about why they were sitting there and why NASA was important to them. It was really pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, we connect on that level. I think the biggest challenge I see in society today is there's so much change, there's so much disruption. There's changing nature of work, how you interact with people, issues with everything, that we're all looking for an understanding of what's going on and where's my place there. There's the sense of what's the meaning of what's going on. I think that's, at the core what a story does. It allows us to connect with each other so that we can have meaningful conversations that give a sense of understanding. If you couldn't use the word story, what would you replace it with? And perhaps understanding would be a word that would be used to convey that.
That's nice. That's so nice. I do want to give the anonymous attendee some time too, and I know you gave a nod to his question, but they say, often get told, but we don't have a story, or who would be interested in my story. They always do, but how do you approach identifying the story that will engage? One thing. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'll just quickly react. I think that the easy thing to say is that the best way to find a story that will resonate is to tell stories and to have people who listen to you. Actually, your point about listening is huge, right? And so having that gets to my dad, having people who will listen to stories without having a high barrier to what a story is. Actually, it's like I remember teaching my class at one point, and it was years ago when having ideas was not really the mode thing for Harvard students. And my students said to me, like, "Well, what if I don't have an idea?" And I said, "Well, that's crazy. Like, I have 100 ideas every day, but I have a very low tolerance for what an idea is." And I share them, and I kind of have people around you who don't kind of roll their eyes every time you tell an idea or a story. And so I think finding the right story is, in my view, in my experience, partly a matter of telling a lot of stories.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. One of the techniques I sometimes do for myself, but also for others, is just picking out a word or a theme of what we're looking into. And so, I mean, one of the things you can talk about is, I always like to ask the question of proudest moment. Tell me about what made you proud being here. And people come up with things. One of the things that always gets a reaction is tell me about, a big failure or a mistake. What happened? And if people are comfortable, that's a risky one because people may not want to share that. But people then talk about, what they're doing, or at the start of a project or a team, also tell me the story of your challenge. I think everything can go back to Lord of the Rings from the standpoint of you're getting together with these people that you would never socialize with. You probably don't like them. In Lord of the Rings, it's hobbits, it's humans, it's elves and all this kind of stuff. In work, it's procurement people, it's scientists, it's engineers, it's legal folks. But you're coming together because you can't do it separately, and you have a challenge. What are the experiences? What are the problems? And how are you going to work things together? And so, I like to also start with project teams saying, tell me the story of what this is going to look like when this is over. What's going to happen? And they'll come up with really fascinating, it's also, I think it also gets a little bit into their mood, because you'll get people who will tell these wonderful success stories, and you'll get other people on the team who will tell you just horror stories. It's like, wow, where did you get that from? And there's a little bit of truth of all of that.
I think we're getting the big kind of cane that's pulling us off stage at the moment. So I want to say thank you so much, David, Edward, for sharing your stories, sharing your wisdom with us. It's been a really powerful session. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Jessica. Nice to see you, Dad. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a pleasure. Thank you, David. As always, great to see you, Jessica. Thank you, everybody.